evening and good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for attending our session, Financing Nature-Based Innovation Strategy and Communications Manager for the Nature Conservancy's Water Funds Program. And I'll be moderating this excellent panel today. So we have Rowan Roderick-Jones. He is the director of the Nature Conservancy's Urban Water Markets Program. We have Sophie Tremolet, Europe's Water Security Director, and Eric Hallstein, Senior Director of the Water Investment Fund. Each of them will be bringing forward unique case studies that highlight innovative ways to fund nature-based solutions for water security. And there are a few themes or principles to look out for as they're sharing their experiences. They'll speak about how to leverage philanthropy dollars to prepare nature-based solutions projects that can eventually then transition off of those philanthropic dollars and start to leverage more sustainable funding or financing sources. You'll also note that many of the cases really smartly tap into existing policies to better deploy capital towards their nature-based solutions projects so they can eventually reach scale. And lastly, the use of markets to drive the development of more NBS projects, and notably more effective NBS projects, is a great mechanism to increase the size and the pace of investments channeled towards nature-based solutions projects. So before we get started, there's just kind of a few rules of engagement. Because we're on a webinar, all attendees will be muted and their videos will be turned off. So if you have a question for one of the panelists, please use the QA function at the bottom of your screen there. And if you see a question that you like, and you want it to be answered, go ahead and give it an upvote, and that'll bring it higher up to our attention. So I'll be monitoring throughout the conversation, and we'll do our best to either answer all questions live or respond directly in the QA feature. I'm going to hand it over now to our first panelist, Sophie Tremolet. Sophie, you can just tell me next when you want me to switch slides.
Hi, thank you very much, Brooke, and good evening or good afternoon, good morning, everybody. If you could go to the first slide of the presentation. So my name is Sophie Tremolet. I'm based in London. I'm the Europe Water Security Director, and I will talk to you about how we are working on mobilizing investments in nature-based solutions for water security. Next slide, please. As a point of context, this session, when it was first proposed to CWE, was designed as a showcase session. So effectively to show the type of work, the diverse type of work that the Nature Conservancy as an organization is carrying out in this area. So this is why we're organizing this session as a single organization to tell you a bit more about our work. In a nutshell, we are a leading global conservation organization with a mission to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends. We're quite large, with 4,000 staff distributed around 72 countries, with the heart of the organization being in the United States. And you'll hear from my colleagues, Eric, Rowan, and Brooke, who are all in the US. We have three interrelated priorities, which are really at the nexus between climate mitigation and adaptation and biodiversity protection. And we increasingly see that these agendas are really closely related to each other. Next slide, please. So one area in which I work particularly is looking at how we can mobilize greater investment for nature-based solutions for water security. Which are nature-based solutions which generate benefits for water through improving and maintaining water quality, maintaining and improving river flows and aquifer recharge, or reducing the impact of flooding, but are also generating a wealth of other co-benefits which need to be taken into the financing equation, if you want, in order to mobilize investments for their adoption. So they generate benefits in terms of climate change mitigation, reducing greenhouse gases, for carbon sequestration, from adaptation as well, by reducing soil erosion, improving soil, reducing the frequency and intensity of fires, floods, and droughts, for biodiversity conservation in terms of landscape diversity, the protection and expansion of natural habitats, but also, and that's very important in the COVID-19 context, they generate benefits for human health and well-being, both in physical terms, but also in mental terms, and for creating resilient jobs and social cohesion through promoting the urban-rural solidarity. Next slide, please. The fact that they generate so many benefits in a way makes it more challenging to finance them, because these benefits can accrue to different types of beneficiaries. What we found in our work is that often a main beneficiary would be a utility service provider, for example, such as a water provider, that is looking to invest in those solutions as an alternative to grey infrastructure investment. For example, to reduce the entry of pollutants into the water and thereby reducing its treatment costs, or reducing the entry of sediments into the water. But many other users stand to benefit, including the large water users, which are using that same water, such as industry and farmers, and also the local governments, general public, who can capture these co-benefits, the workers who get the green jobs, and of course the environment, both locally, because many of these NBS are very small scale, and globally when we're talking about climate. So that means that in order to make them financially viable, we need to take into account the possibility of multiple revenue streams, such as tariffs associated with services. So we found that some water companies have been willing to assign a portion of their water tariffs to invest in this type of green infrastructure, especially when it reduces their costs. It can also be payments for ecosystem services when the implementers are farmers, for example, and they need to be compensated for their investment. It can be public subsidies, and there's a wide array of different types of public subsidies that can be mobilized, including farming subsidies. That's what we find in Europe, where the common agricultural policy is being used for this type of investments. It can be, and this is kind of a new funding stream, but credits for carbon sequestration, biodiversity, or water replenishment are gaining in prominence as a source of funding for these activities. And lastly, visitor fees and tourism revenue. So the multiplicity of revenue streams make it particularly challenging, next slide, in order to mobilize financing. And the solution that the Nature Conservancy has put together to address this issue is that of a water fund, which is effectively a financial and governance mechanism to unite stakeholders around a common goal to contribute to water security, and for mobilizing investments from all these different beneficiaries into investments in nature-based solutions and sustainable watershed management. So it can mobilize public funding, water tariffs, payment for ecosystem services, all the range of funding streams that I have mentioned above. Next slide. So in this presentation, which is a showcase, I'm going to talk to you about two specific examples of water funds worldwide. The first one was established back in 2000 in Quito. Since then, we've applied them in 41 locations throughout Latin America, North America, Africa, and Asia. In Europe, I'm working on the establishment of two, one in Spain, one in England, but we will talk to you about specific examples now. Next slide. One of the cases that is particularly interesting in terms of financing is that of the Greater Cape Town Water Fund, where the investment in nature-based solution is focused on removing invasive species, which have encroached about 2/3 of the basin that is supplying water to Cape Town, and which is a key contributor to the drought condition and the water scarcity condition that the city has experienced in the last few years. So we signed a memorandum of understanding with the city in the heart of a drought that it was experiencing back in 2016. And we looked at how investments in removing invasive species could be better focused and targeted in specific areas where they could generate the greatest return of investment. This analysis fed into a business case, which has then provided the basis for establishing a water fund. Next slide. the business case has been instrumental to demonstrate to potential investors the value of these investments. It showed that targeted investment could save up to 2 months worth of water per year at 1/10 of the cost of the next available option, which is investment in desalination. It also highlighted the profile of costs and the pace at which we could expect returns on this investment. And we identified that we could save up to 100 million cubic meters over the course of 30 years with a front-loaded investment in removing the most spreadable, if you want, of these species, and continuing the investment over time to maintain and reduce the spread. Next slide. So based on this analysis, we've then worked on defining a sustainable financing strategy and developing some decision support systems that enable partners to understand where investments are going in, what is the pace of progress, which amount of funding is going to be necessary in order to maintain this pace of progress. This is just an example of this decision support system, which is publicly available and has provided the basis as well for mobilizing funding from the municipality over the next 3 years, and also for defining governance arrangements which are permanent and will enable the fund to continue to invest over the course of the 25 years, which is the length of the investment that is required. Next slide. I'd like to take you now to another area of our work, which is in the US. So back to our home country, if you want. There we have the example of the Brandywine Christina Healthy Water Fund, which is active in the Delaware and Pennsylvania basin, where there's a severe issues with water quality, which have meant that they were fishing and swimming restrictions, and growing concerns about stormwater runoff, flooding and erosion. The problem, as we found in many places where we're active, is that there are conservation efforts at play, but they're often not well coordinated. And most funding as a result is limited to quite short-term grants and private philanthropic contributions. So the fund, next slide, looked at establishing a system that would enable effectively much longer term funding flows to be provided, and to do that on the basis of results. Many of you might have heard of other vehicles which are being put together, such as the Forest Resilience Bond or Environmental Impact Bond. This is getting at the same principle, whereby we identify the practices that yield the greatest pollution reductions for the lowest cost. And then the fund itself can sell credits to the municipalities which are willing to buy those credits for the implementation of these activities. These services and these results are independently verified, so that there is strong guarantee that the beneficiaries are getting value for their money. So this structure was established by TNC Delaware with some initial grant funding. It's important to highlight that these structures tend to be quite difficult to set up in the first place. The transaction costs are quite heavy, but they could, if replicated, help mobilize greater long-term sustainable funding for these activities. And our objective is also, on the basis of these models, to mobilize repayable financing. Next slide. So this is just to finish my presentation, a picture of what we're doing to mobilize investment in NBS for water security. We're working on the ground, so you've heard of some of these on the ground activities, but we're also having a number of cross-cutting activities to create knowledge and spread knowledge to support policy, and to support water sector financiers to invest in natural infrastructure. And for that, I just want to give a call out that in the next coming months, we're going to work very closely with DFIs, development finance institutions, and private investors to document the lessons learned through our experience, but also through the sector experience. This is emerging as an area of work, and we are documenting this experience with a view to launch these documents, these guidance documents at the World Water Forum in Dakar in 2021. So if you're interested in joining that effort, the next slide and final slide is my contact detail. Please get in touch, and we're very interested in hearing from you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sophie. So next we'll hear from Rowan. Before he starts, I want to just give a quick plug. We will be putting these slides, some other resources, and the recording of this session on the World Water Week Session page for those who are interested. Thank you to the anonymous person who asked, jogged my memory. Rowan, I'm going to quickly grab this chat so I can monitor it without interrupting, and you go ahead.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you to our last speaker, Sophie. Good day to our attendees, wherever you are, and thank you for joining this session. I'm Rowan Roderick Jones. I'm an ecological and civil engineer, and I've been with Nature Conservancy for 4 years as our Director of Global Urban Water Markets. Today, I'm going to speak with you about a particular type of environmental market, and this is stormwater or water quality markets, and about scaling nature-based solutions in these markets through partnership with private investors and landowners. Next slide, please. I work with the Nature Conservancy's urban investment team, and we develop, share, and help to implement models for urban environmental regulations and markets. And we then stimulate those new markets by delivering nature-based solutions. These are our projects on the ground to create an initial market supply. Next slide, please. I'm going to quickly walk you through 3 examples of different types of stormwater markets and how we are working within them to create value for regulated entities and market participants. Keep in mind that markets are generally intended to create cost-effective pathways to compliance under a regulatory condition. So where you may begin with one pathway to compliance, typically the regulated entity going at it alone to achieve their objectives. There's an animation here, so please forward the slide. Next. And the broader benefit of markets is to create multiple pathways for compliance and least cost options. So keep this little diagram in mind as we'll come back to it in more detail in a few minutes. Next slide, please. So the first case is Philadelphia. In 2012, the city of Philadelphia was issued an order from the US Environmental Protection Agency to reduce combined sewer overflows in the city. Philadelphia made the bold decision to use the entirely nature-based approach to addressing the problem. One of the strategies implemented, and one of the simplest approaches to creating a market for investment in nature-based infrastructure, was to provide direct, full-cost monetary incentives, as well as a stormwater fee reduction, private landowners delivering stormwater projects under the grant program. So this created a market, but it was a market with one buyer, in this case, the city. But most property owners lack the capital to design and deliver projects within that market. And this is where the Nature Conservancy and other organizations can partner with landowners and investors to deliver projects on their behalf. We would get directly reimbursed by the city, can repay any loans taken to build the project, and the landowner keeps the stormwater fee reduction. So it's a win-win. In Philadelphia, projects delivered on private land through the direct incentive program can cost about 50% less than public projects delivered directly by the water department. So real good cost efficiencies there. Next slide, please. The second case is Washington, D.C. D.C. is among the most rapidly urbanizing cities in the US. It is at the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia rivers. Unmanaged stormwater runoff is the largest source of pollution to those rivers. In Washington, D.C., federal regulations require developers to prevent runoff from leaving their properties. This is costly for developers, particularly those with limited space on their land and who would typically build underground stormwater capture and infiltration systems. The district has established a trading program which allows developers to purchase stormwater credits from an off-site supplier. So now instead of all these small underground treatment systems, you can now pool funding to create larger systems using nature-based solutions to manage runoff. And these use vegetation often to create green space, reduce urban heat, improve air quality, and create urban habitat. And all of these benefits can come with supply projects delivered under the program. Another significant benefit is that stormwater management capacity can be transferred to places where it is most needed, typically in underinvested communities. Like many cities, DC has a downtown core where there's great development pressure. That's greater than the development pressure in less invested communities on the urban fringe. So the hope was that these new nature-based projects would be built in places where land was cheaper, in the less wealthy part of the district where access to green space and infrastructure investment was also most needed. But there were no supply projects, and beginning in 2014, the Nature Conservancy stepped in to partner with landowners, such as the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., as well as private investors to deliver credit supply projects. Our first major stormwater project in D.C. was delivered in 2018, and we're now the largest supplier of stormwater credits in the market, delivering projects at between 30 and 45% of the cost of projects delivered by public agencies. Our current projects manage runoff from over 35 acres of urban land, treating tens of millions of gallons of runoff per year, and we plan to build more. We've raised millions in investment capital from private financial partners, money which is being used directly to bring nature to the district, improve water quality, and provide a return on capital. Next slide, please. The third case, in the Chesapeake Bay region, which includes areas across 4 states and Washington, D.C., federal regulations require a 20% reduction in sediment and nutrient pollution by 2030. All states are obliged to contribute proportionally to the goal. Water quality credit trading is allowed, but few trades have been transacted. Our strategy has been to finance, build, and operate low-cost pollution reduction credits by retrofitting existing stormwater detention basins on private lands with smart outlet controls. These controls allow runoff to be retained for longer periods of time, facilitating greater pollutant removal. The image here shows some of the automated outfall system components, which can open and close the outlets automatically based on local forecasted rainfall. We sell the water quality credits generated by these projects to state agencies with regulatory mandates, and our private investors receive a return on their capital. Due in large part to the new technology, we've been able to deliver credits at an astounding 10% of the cost of the business as usual approach by some of these agencies. So here, a combination of water quality markets and new technology is creating cost-effective pathways to compliance. Next slide, please. Our next big project is in Los Angeles, where we hope to apply learnings from the strategies illustrated in the last 3 case studies to create a more comprehensive market structure with multiple pathways for compliance. In Los Angeles, it's estimated that the county has a $20 billion funding gap to achieve regulated clean water goals. And last year, county residents voted to approve a new tax that will raise $300 million per year to be applied to water quality improvements. This is a big step to getting funds on the table that can help to kickstart a market. I'll just add that recently, through a grant from Amazon, we've also begun working with water authorities in Berlin, in Germany, to explore how urban stormwater markets might be implemented in that region. We hope the work undertaken there can also become a model for other European cities. Next slide, please. So one vision for what could be implemented might look something like this. You'll recall that we begin with a regulation, and this is going to be a blow up of that little diagram that you saw earlier. In this case, a pollution cap. We want to get to compliance, which means more stormwater projects. So how do we get there? How do we create pathways and options? We can break out our strategies in terms of funding sources and payers. These are not always the same. The enabling policy or programs that are needed, and a delivery mechanism. We have some more animation here, so I'm going to just say next as we walk through each step. Next animation, please. We begin with a business as usual approach where public projects are paid for directly by the regulated entity, perhaps a city or public agency, with public funding and possibly revenue from a stormwater utility fee. Delivery is through normal service contracts or potentially public-private partnerships or design, bid, build type contracts. Next, please. With revenue coming in from the new tax, we can also implement a direct monetary incentive program like exists in Philadelphia, the first case we discussed a moment ago, which pays the full cost of new stormwater projects on private land. Next, please. Then we implement a stormwater ordinance requiring developers to manage runoff like in Washington, D.C. Here, a developer becomes the regulated entity and are using their own funds to deliver projects on their own properties. Next, please. And now we implement an in-lieu fee program, which gives the same developers the alternative of paying the public utility for compliance in place of doing projects on their own properties. We might also create a credit trading program, allowing developers to purchase capacity from private suppliers. So developers now have 3 potential options. build projects themselves, pay an in lieu fee, or purchase capacity from another private supplier. Next, please. There are a few other nuances, and I don't want to get into too many details in the short amount of time, and so I'll just click through on this one. So once a market is established, we can then begin to bring in other regulated entities, new payers like industry or transportation departments. And then this starts to look more like a region-wide water quality market like we see in Chesapeake Bay. Lots of payers requiring essentially the same service. And based on our experience, they should be able to obtain that service for a fraction of the normal business as usual cost. So we end up with a really nice system of markets that serve multiple regulatory mandates and which cumulatively create the options and mechanisms for least cost compliance and which can be further designed to incentivize nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So I hope that this has been an informative crash course in stormwater and water quality markets, and I just want to let you know that we will be providing related knowledge resources on this topic in the near future. So please keep an eye out for new information from the Nature Conservancy coming soon, and we'll be sure to let all of you know when these are available. Last slide, please. I'll just close with this note. Half of the global population lives in urban areas, and 1.5 million people are added to the global population, urban population, every week. And the potential impact in nature is enormous. We have an opportunity to influence how nature is incorporated as an asset as cities grow. So my personal mission is to help cities understand the value of nature and the services it provides, and to act on that by creating regulations and programs that facilitate investment in nature. So that's why I'm here at the Nature Conservancy, and that's why I love the work that I do. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Rowan. That 8th slide there with all the animation was just absolute gold. I am really excited to be able to upload that. So
thank you for manipulating that very well.
All right, our next presenter is Eric Hallstein. Since we are, tight on time here, I'm just going to have him take it away.
Thanks everybody for joining us, and of course thanks to Rowan, Brooke for facilitating, and Sophie. I'm going to talk about a fund that the Nature Conservancy has partnered to start, named the Sustainable Water Impact Fund. And more than anything else, this is an example or a case of leveraging institutional investment capital, so really kind of late stage, mature investment capital, in order to deliver nature-based solutions in a way that provides societal benefit, environmental benefit, and also benefit for the investors of this particular fund. I would like you to take away 2 lessons. One is that institutional capital is a tremendous pool of resources for the work that we all do. It does come with constraints though, and it's worth understanding those constraints at project inception and really planning for those and addressing them as one develops a project. And you'll understand why I'm making this point in a few minutes. The second is that policy and thoughtful policy is an incredibly important enabler of these private sector actors, and facilitating and creating these markets, things like the offsets that Rowan was talking about, is in part what's enabling the possibility that this fund has achieved the scale that it has. Next slide. It's not showing on my computer, Brooke, but maybe you advanced. There we go, great. The problem that we set out to solve or address with this fund is one that most of those on the call are grappling with, which is that about 2/3 of the world is facing periods of the year or years of severe water shortage. And there are lots of great metrics about how dire that situation is. One of the key metrics is around just how much of that use of water or the water scarcity is driven by agriculture. And here in California, where I'm based, about 80% of all of the fresh water in the state is used by agricultural interests. And what we've been seeing in California as a geography where this fund is operating is that through a bunch of regulations, and this gets to the policy point, we've begun to regulate the availability of water to the agricultural sector. So here in California, there's something called the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which regulates, finally, how much water farmers are able to take out of the ground. And that has created in a sense, kind of the key enabling condition for this particular fund to exist. Next slide. The other thing that we observed, and again, I'm using California as an example, but this is a global fund, is that in these geographies like here, where there's such a tremendous tension between agricultural interests and the environment, that institutional investors are often the first movers shaping these landscapes. So the first entrance into the markets in response to that particular piece of regulation that I described earlier are large firms like Hancock Capital and others who can very quickly mobilize their capital and purchase assets and manage those in ways that traditionally don't have environmental considerations as part of it. At the same time that that's, in a sense, creating part of the problem, it's also potentially part of the solution. The private investment capital space, the financial markets, are just an enormous source of funding. Estimates are that globally there's about $88 trillion of money that is available to be deployed. Only a piece of that into impact investing in real assets, of course. But really only a few $100 billion of that is going into any form of impact investing, and a much smaller subset of that, and again, this is the private investment capital, is going into things that have an environmental or a conservation purpose. So one of the questions we grappled with is, why is that, and how can we address that problem? Next slide. The answer was with a partner that's a very well-established private equity firm with a lot of experience in water and agriculture, to create a fund that looks a lot like other funds that a private equity firm and private equity investors would choose to invest in, meaning a 10-year fund with all of the sort of traditional from the outside in aspects of that in terms of capital raising, the asset management, and dispositions. This particular fund, what it does is invest in ag and water assets around the world in order to deliver these nature-based solutions and also competitive returns for investors. And the specific way that this fund does this, I'll walk through the next couple slides. So next slide. Is first to raise investment capital, and the investors in this fund are traditional institutional investors. Next slide. The fund is buying farms and agricultural assets in these different regions that are water scarce, that for whatever reason are not operated in an optimal way. They typically are monocultures. They typically have sort of poor methodologies and usages around water, and a set of other negative environmental impacts associated with pollution runoff and things like that from the agricultural operations. Next slide. Then the fund works to reoperate those properties or those assets in ways that are much more environmentally beneficial. Things like making the crops more diversified, managing the water more thoughtfully, often implementing various forms of groundwater banking and ways of storing water underground where it's much less damaging than surface water reservoirs would be. And in the process, identifying sort of a set of revenue streams that help to generate the returns for the investors, but at the same time, as you can sort of see in this almost cartoon version, a set of things that are environmentally much more amenable. So from a nature-based solution standpoint, all of the things that you're seeing on the right-hand side of this slide in terms of the diversification of crops and the water management have environmental co-benefits associated with them. Next slide. And to be really specific, there's a set of outcomes that we carefully track as part of the fund and that we leverage the Nature Conservancy scientists to help verify around terrestrial habitat, ecosystem health, and things like that. Brooke, that was fine to go ahead. So in terms of what this actually looks like in practice, the next slide will show you. This is a picture from one of the first properties that we purchased. And Brooke, you can advance to that picture that you had. Okay, maybe you're seeing that on your side. Great. Yeah, no worries. So the picture on the left-hand side of the slide is a property that we purchased, which was formerly a very large industrial scale dairy. It had about 80,000 head of cattle on it and all these sort of associated environmental impacts of that. And what's on the right is what part of that property looks like today, where we've implemented a groundwater bank that's being recharged through these basins that you can see here. That's very shallow water, and it creates really suitable habitat for migratory birds that are passing through this part of the United States as they move from Alaska down into the southern latitudes and then back up again. And they have this pinch point right approximately kind of in this area of California where they need a place to land and feed before they keep going. The cows have been completely removed from the property, and actually the revenue source for the investors is the use of that water that is now being banked and can be used during dry periods of the year or during dry years. Next slide. In aggregate, this fund is deploying its capital in multiple geographies around the world. Each asset is managed a little bit differently, but each has the attributes of financial returns for investors and a suite of nature-based solutions that are associated with environmental benefits that are quite significant in terms of the ability to create the sort of wetland habitat that I was describing on the prior slide, and you can also see in this picture here on this slide, the restoration of terrestrial habitat, the provision of water in streams that flow through these geographies where we can put water back into streams when it is needed for the movement of primarily fish species. And we have an ability to influence the way that farm management happens on these properties in ways that reduce pesticide use and nutrient runoff into the different ecosystems. Next slide. So that's really the concept that underpins the Sustainable Water Impact Fund. As mentioned at the beginning, this was designed with an intent to really leverage the large amount of capital that institutional investors have, figuring out how to balance the demands of the investors with the environmental outcomes was part of the puzzle that we solved. And in particular, kind of honing in on those co-benefits that Sophie referenced at the beginning of her presentation in terms of identifying those benefits that provide the revenue for the investors, but also the important environmental and social co-benefits that are achievable. So thank you very much for listening to that, and back to you, Brooke.
Great. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see all of the panelists. I apologize if my internet goes in and out. So we have a few questions here around returns, specifically in the private investor context. So I'm going to go ahead and raise Anthony's question around the return a private investor can expect. Is it on par typically with what an institutional investor might get elsewhere? And he also notes that yesterday HSBC and Pollination announced a wholly commercial $1 billion natural capital fund. So the question there is, can private investors expect similar returns as institutional investors might?
I'll start, and maybe Rowan and Sophie have some comments. That particular fund was designed to deliver better than market returns for institutional investors. And so far, the evidence is that it will do so. It does vary depending upon the asset class and sort of which particular property. And the reason that that is possible in a fund like this that also delivers these impacts is because of the co-benefits. And the idea in particular with this fund that there are opportunities like creating wetlands on top of a groundwater bank that are both actually better for the groundwater banking. The roots of the plants and things like that actually increase the rate of infiltration of water in some positive ways. And also there are ways to bring sources of public funding to projects like that because one has created an environmental co-benefit that is in a sense eligible for some of the funding programs. So from a purely investment perspective on a risk-adjusted basis, the approach is yielding something that has higher returns and lower risk, which is a compelling investment thesis for institutional investors. And the balance to be struck with a fund like that is the financial obligations of a fund like that to its investors need to be balanced with the environmental outcomes and finding those co-benefits and not asking investors to take a significant kind of, in a sense, kind of reduction in returns to get their impact is part of the puzzle that we had to solve in that particular example.
Great. Sophie or Rowan, anything to add there?
Well, yeah, I'll just add that, you know, when we think of the urban stormwater markets and bringing in investors, I think there's maybe a misconception that investing in outcomes that have, are positive for the environment somehow will give you less return or you would be expecting. But we really try to structure our deals so that they are attractive to institutional investors and provide rates of return that are competitive with their other investment choices. That can be very difficult in early stage markets that are less proven. So oftentimes what we see in a new market space where there are not a lot of supply projects coming, we'll often see a blend of philanthropy and private institutional investment so that we can really lower the risk, explore the market, make sure that we understand what the market is actually able to return. And then we start scaling up there once we really know what the investment outcome is on those projects.
Yeah. And to that, I would just like to add that,
Sophie, go ahead.
If you hear me, yeah. Would just like to add that what's interesting is letting aside investors, the private water companies, for example, have found that this type of investments can generate a greater return on investment than some alternative grey infrastructure investments. So there are not that many cases, but there are some cases in the UK or in France or in the US where they have been able to lower their costs and therefore, generate a greater return internally, let alone to external investors. However, despite these cases, we're not seeing enough of those activities taking place, partly because of the technical challenges and governance challenges that they're facing. So that's precisely what we're working on, addressing those barriers and also documenting the cases where the water companies have been able, including private companies, have been able to generate the same results at a lower cost and therefore increase their own internal rate of return.
And related to the points that you all brought up, what kind of either market rules or structure can really help to reduce or eliminate those risks to private investors? What have you seen have particularly worked well in your scenarios?
I can maybe briefly describe one from the Washington, D.C. case. When we first started doing our first project in Washington, D.C. to deliver credits, there was a lot of hesitancy from investors because, really, if you're going to put down $1 million and say we want to build some projects and you don't know that you're going to be able to sell those credits because that market hasn't been proven, you need some guarantee that you're going to get that money back as an investor. And so we worked with Department of Energy and Environment in Washington, D.C. to essentially set up a purchase guarantee program. That purchase guarantee is a buyer of last resort. The credits end up being bought by the district in that case. And so that really created some safety and reduced the risk for our investors. And that was the sort of tipping point that enabled us to close that deal and ensure that our investors felt safe helping to create those credits in the market.
In that example that I provided, one of the areas that has been important is the robustness of the trading rules around groundwater credits. So to the extent that each basin has established a set of rules that allow farmers to move and trade water kind of within a single basin, so you're not transferring water outside of a basin, but moving it sort of to be optimally allocated within a basin, that the better understood, the more resilient, the more accepted the rules are for those trades, frankly, the better ability of a fund like the one I was describing to balance those environmental needs and the environmental outcomes.
Great. There's a couple questions coming up here around kind of motivation for investing and whether or not investing, typically in the cases that you all have brought up, the investment has generated return. There's some questions around, will people invest and accept lower returns, or will people invest and think, I'm investing for the greater good rather than expecting an exact return on my investment? In your experiences, what have been, the drivers for investing in these types of projects? And then 2, what types of investment in terms of rate of return are people really expecting?
I'm happy to lead off on this one. Is I think that the investment world is becoming increasingly diverse and arguably democratized in the sense of much greater access to various investment types and vehicles by a wide range of people who participate. The particular fund that I was talking about specifically targeted institutional investors who are fiduciaries and do have requirements in terms of what they deliver to their sort of against their mandates. And it was important in structuring that fund to make sure that they could pursue their or fulfill their fiduciary obligations while also delivering these impacts. And the fund is structured in a way that there are sort of ways to safeguard the environment, but also create incentives for delivering those. In speaking with many of these institutions, what I would notice is they would often have a sort of impact investing group that had a much smaller amount of capital than the institutional side. So the private equity or the real assets desk was much better capitalized, so to speak, in terms of their mandate than the impact investing group. And we were fortunate, often we would start the conversation on the impact investing side, but it would migrate over to the more traditional desk that had a lot more capital to deploy. And that was one of our objectives because of the sort of attributes of that particular fund. But there was also appetite to understand kind of when it would have been more appropriate to move something towards the impact side. And there sort of because of the rules, it would have they would have been able to kind of make clearer trade-offs and give up some on the financial return for investors. But again, I think we were speaking to like sort of a slice of the market, a very big slice of the market, but a slice nonetheless. And I think sort of from there, sort of across, this incredibly complex landscape of investors that has really emerged, I think there's a lot of room for folks who are really about optimizing impact and almost don't need financial return other than returning the principal that has been provided, whether it was debt or equity. But Sophie, Rowan, I'd be curious what your experience has been.
I'd say I agree with much of what you said there, Eric. And we've also been looking for sustainable ways to keep market and progress going. And one of the concepts which we're hoping to implement in some of the cities that we work is a revolving fund. And really what we're looking for there is someone who has more of a philanthropy perspective that wants to help kickstart markets and create a business. So the business might be developing their own profit, reinvesting that back into new projects. And it's really kickstarted by a well-meaning donor. So I think that, the partnerships between donors and then private businesses that want to participate in the market is really important. And oftentimes that seed funding is really what can start things off.
Yeah, well, one point I just wanted to follow up on, also linked to the point I was making earlier about the sort of private water company investing in those assets, which is an interesting, there are not that many of them, many water companies are public, but what is interesting is that in the UK or in France, where there's a lot of private water companies, they've been interested in investing in those nature-based assets as a way to fulfill their sense of purpose as well. So a number of these private companies are coming up with purpose statement stating the type of responsibilities they have towards society as a whole. That's the case for the largest water company in the world, Veolia, which is Paris-based, and announced its purpose statement last year, where they basically signal to investors that they want not only to be accountable based on their financial returns and financial performance, but also their environmental performance, their social performance, and their contribution to biodiversity. So they've defined a set of indicators based on which they are assessing their performance and are reporting to their investors upon. And they effectively want to train investors to look at these indicators alongside their financial performance. The English companies are doing the same. So I think that's a very interesting trend, because that's how they justify to their employees, to their customers, making those type of investments, which cost less, but also generate these other benefits that they're now actively tracking through their set of indicators in their reporting.
Yeah, and in your cases, have you all seen that there's sort of a minimum size of threshold for investment that they're willing to consider? And it may differ depending on who your primary investors are. So if you need to caveat a little bit, that would be great to add that extra background. And then there's a second kind of tag-on question to that. Is grant capital still required to originate a lot of these projects? Is that what you're finding?
Some of our earliest projects in the urban stormwater space were really quite small, and we got $1 to $2 million to do a first project to prove the case that it can be done with a return on capital. And so it can start small, but the expectation is that once proven, you'd grow into something that's more attractive to larger scale investors. And I think we've done that. And to answer the second question about, is grant funding important? Yes, it was very important to also get off the ground in DC and actually create a business which is sustainable. And we've done that as well. And we're not relying on grant funding anymore. We're relying on the income from the deals that we do and the projects that we create to create the supply in those markets. So it's a process that begins usually with some need for a combination of philanthropy and investment, and can be scaled from very small up into the much sort of larger numbers. We're not getting into huge scale at this point in the urban water markets, the hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's kind of what you might expect 10 years down the road when you're operating in multiple markets and getting pooled funding to do programs in those markets.
Mm. Eric or Sophie, anything else?
I would underscore that this role of the grant funding, and that's not a component of the fund that I described as it's been launched, but it leverages, I think, many years of support from Nature Conservancy donors and others to help understand things like the relationships between the biodiversity in these areas and water scarcity and the intersection with human well-being and health. And those were all factors, in a sense, in kind of bodies of science that we're using to help inform the ways that those kind of projects are being structured in, as I was describing before, sort of more diverse, but also ways that provide other societal benefit. So in a broad sense, there's been an incredibly important role for grant funding. That particular product, if you would like to call it that, was designed to be of sufficient scale that it wasn't at that scale at a point where it needed any more grant funding.
Yeah, and I would just add to that the type of grant funding that is provided is very important, because some of these transactions, effectively the grant funding is not needed so much for investments on the ground, but for the gray matter, the structuring of those deals that goes behind. So in the Cape Town example that I mentioned, most of the grant funding that they had been receiving so far was more for implementation, but then we got a small grant, 150,000 from Water Unite, that helped us effectively prepare a financial model and conduct some more in-depth assessment of the most suitable governance arrangements. And this type of funding is more difficult to generate and to obtain, because you can't attribute it, you can't sort of link it to results of the ground, but that's the type of grant funding that can be very critical in order to leverage long-term finance. So I think the quality of grant funding is very important, and we would need more grant funders willing to take on that bet and to really think long-term about how to deploy their grant and philanthropy funding.
Great. So we have a couple questions that pop up on the sort of project development side of things. As you guys you may not have really experienced this in your specific use cases that you brought forward, but how are you all dealing with unclear land rights or ownership in these types of projects? how do you kind of get around that in the implementation and ensure that you're able to drive value in a return for investors?
I'll start, but I bet this is going to go to you, Sophie, pretty quickly. Is that in the particularly outside of the United States, where obviously here the land ownership and land rights are better established. Not to say that they're necessarily equitable or fair, but just that they're well understood. Is that in other geographies, a significant part of the diligence is into understanding land rights, land tenure, and sort of even impacts on communities and who may be downstream or may be impacted by a particular project, to understand how their property rights might be affected. And I think in all cases, if there isn't really a solid answer and a rigorous answer about how those water rights or how those property rights are allocated, I think that would make it very difficult to invest. Not from the perspective of poor investment, from the perspective of not understanding kind of the unintended consequences of an action or an investment. And I think that's one where I think it would be much more likely to require, a lot of work working with the community or with a particular location to really understand the impacts of a project and what that community or ecosystem needed. But Sophie or Rowan, this may be something you would like to build upon.
Thanks. I think one point about the way water funds work is that there is no transfer of land rights or water rights necessarily. So effectively, because they work as coordinating mechanisms, there doesn't need to be such a transfer. But what it does is that it channels investment that can come from multiple sources. And depending on the governance structure that is chosen, these investments don't even need to go into one pot. They can continue to be channeled through the existing channels, but effectively be better coordinated and aimed at a common goal. So to that extent, it is possible to limit the impact on water rights and land rights, because you don't need a transfer of land ownership or water rights ownership in order to make those happen. But of course, they need to be considered in each of their in each of their locality, and that would be a big part of the governance due diligence that needs to be done before setting up these programs.
Great. Rowan, any last words to add before we close out?
Nothing to add on that point. Thank you.
Great. All right, so I'm just gonna pop up some of these last messages here. These are kind of key takeaways that myself and the other panelists wanted you all to leave with. If you've learned nothing from this presentation, please take away these 5 points here. I will be posting online on the CV website for this session, the recording and associated resources. And of course, if you need to get in touch with any one of us, here's our contact information. Thank you all. Have a good evening, day, or afternoon.
Thank you. Goodbye, everybody.